Hello friends, today I will talk about post-colonial African literature. The objective of today's lecture is to give you an idea about post-colonial African literature. In this lecture, first I will try to trace the whole gamut of African literature, how it has evolved, and then I will emphasize on the post-colonial African writers and the important texts. So, in layman's language, African literature basically refers to a comprehensive, complex and creative literature to and from Africa. But different critics belonging to different school of thoughts have provided varied interpretations about African literature. One of such critics and one of the pillars of African literature, Chinua Achebe, he doesn't see African literature as one unit, but rather he sees African literature as a group of associated units, in fact the sum of all national and ethnic literatures of Africa. If we talk another writer who is a stalwart on African literature, Nadine Gordimer. Nadine Gordimer is of the opinion, she believes that African literature done in any language by African themselves and by others of whatever skin color they are, but who share the African experience and who have centered African consciousness. According to her, this is what African literature is all about. Now, if we trace the growth of African literature, we will find that we can divide African literature, the whole gamut of African literature, into three broad categories. The first category is traditional or the oral literature of Africa. The second category is the literature written in indigenous African languages. And the third category is the literature written in European languages. Now, when we talk of the first category, that is the traditional oral literature, that might be in the form of prose, verb, verse or proverb. It is generally described as orature. Now, orature flourished in Africa primarily because Africa had a very widespread illiteracy, and through orature, this oral literature was handed over generations after generations for thousands of years. The contents of this orature may differ. It can range from a single sentence up to a proverb, or it can range up to an epic, which is formed or has to be performed over a period of time. Now, this oral literature or this verbal form of African literature, they had dual purpose. Their purpose was to provide entertainment, and at the same time their purpose was also to provide instructions. So this African literature, the oral African literature, they served as a medium to explain the creation of the universe and the various essence of activities that is done by the Almighty God and the various creatures and their intra and interrelationships. These oratures or the oral folklore was also used to reinstate the faith in group values and discourage the antisocial tendencies. Now, if we talk about the span of African literature, the whole gamut of African literature, the written literature, they span over a period of 5,000 years roughly. And if we talk about the modern African writing, it is a result of the association between the West and Africa. The West, because Africa remained colonized for a very long time by the various Eurocentric or the European colonial powers, and one of the striking features of this African novels, which is written in these modern African novels, is this: there will be always this particular genre. There will be always a particular body of literature in this genre whose aim is based on an imaginative discourse, primarily occupied with the modes of resistance. So one of the striking features you will find in these African novels of African writing is there will be a voice of resistance. Why? What they are resisting against? They are resisting against the cultural hegemony. The cultural hegemony, which cultural hegemony? The Western cultural hegemony in determining the African states of consciousness. So this is one of the most striking features of modern African writing. And this strain of protest, this voice of protest in these African writings is found in almost all the African writers, especially the post-colonial writer, post-colonial with a hyphen, especially the writers between 1960s and 70s. And these writers between 1960s and 70s are also referred to as the post-colonial with a hyphen literature. So in this era, why you find this sense of protest? Because in this era, if you see that it has a political connection also. In this era, there were a lot of African nations who gained their political independence from their colonized countries. These colonizing countries, who were mainly the European colonial powers, they exploited these African nations for a long time. So during this post-colonial, after independence literature, there is always a voice of protest in these African writers. And later on, if we move ahead with this post-colonial African literature, we will also understand that this post-colonial African literature is a mode to comprehend the African psyche and the African psyche both in the physical and other parameters of the African life. This African literature, this post-colonial African literature also symbolizes, this is also one of the very important features, it symbolizes the African intellectual response to their experiences of colonialism and neo-colonialism. So this was something new. African intellectualism and African intellectual response was something new. This rich tradition of the African continent, the various trials and tribulations of the contemporary life, induced by various socio-economic experience of colonialism and its agonizing neo-colonial aftermath, almost all these traits will be found in most of the African literary texts written during this time. The greatest contributors of this time, if you ask, are Wole Soyinka, Mafahili, and Ngugi Thongo. And what is special about these writers? These writers, through their writings, helped in familiarizing the African consciousness. Where? In Europe and in America. And one of the cornerstones, one of the touchstones, you can say, happened in post-colonial literature, post-colonial African literature, was when Wole Soyinka received the Nobel Prize for Literature. Now, Wole Soyinka, when he received the Nobel Prize for Literature from Africa, it represented the West's acknowledgement of the Nigerian literary extraordinary. So this was the first time that such a prestigious prize, this prize, Nobel Prize by Wole Soyinka, was paved the way for the African literature, especially the post-colonial African literature, to flourish. Now, African English literature now, if you see, is a very well-known and recognized body of literature, and you have tremendous writers, tremendous writers' writings, and one of them is, we all know, is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which is a classic. and which is approved in almost all the syllabi of universities in the West. And among all the, one more interesting thing is, among all the African countries, it is Nigeria which offers the greatest literary output, notably. And if you see the compositions of these Nigerian writers, for example, Chinua Achebe, Ben Okri, Wole Soyinka, they are often pervaded with a sense of dismay, pain at the state of Nigeria during the colonial as well as the post-colonial era. Nigerian literary works, they act as a medium. They serve as a medium to reflect the thoughts of the nation, and the objective is to rekindle the long submissive and often humiliated culture and society that they suffered. Now, Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Christopher Okibo, and John Paper Clark, they are often referred to as the quartet of Nigerian literary scene in the post-independent times. I repeat, they are known as the quartet of Nigerian literary scene. Who are the four writers? Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Christopher Okibo, and John Paper. Why they are called quartets? Their contributions are tremendous. They were very brilliant and self-assured writers who were known as having very reformistic views and perceptions about Nigeria and about Africa. Soyinka, in his works such as Poems of Africa, Myth, Poems of Black Africa and Myth, Literature and African World, theorized the identification and valorization of a distinct black world. Chinua Achebe, one of the other renowned Nigerian novelists, as we all know, he is known for his groundbreaking novel, Things Fall Apart, in which he has remarkably painted a comprehensive picture of the Igbo, IGBO, Igbo society at the end of the 19th century. The other famous writings of Chinua Achebe are The Anthills of Savannah, Arrow of God, which obviously renders the Nigerian consciousness struggling to redefine itself within the oppressive confines of the Western world, thus indicating a psychological crisis in Nigerian literature. So, that's why they are called the reformist writers. The torch of the Nigerian literature after these writers, after Achebe, Ben Okri, they were forwarded in the hands of the second generation poets such as Odia Ofimam, Nigigo Sundare, and authors of caliber of B. Bandile Thomas and Ben Okri, obviously. Ben Okri received the Booker Prize in 1991 for his novel The Famished Road. I repeat, Ben Okri received Booker Prize in 1991 for his famous novel The Famished Road. The main themes of Ben Okri novels are themes of corruption, themes of military excesses, and nationalism. These are the basic themes which form the major themes of Ben Okri's novels. Thus, if you see that all the Nigerian literary artists, they question and challenge the too modest representation of Africa as cultic and mystifying land, as a dark continent, as a formless area of life devoid of human significance. So all these writers, through their works, they always question, they challenge all these wrong notions. Instead, through their writings, they highlight the birth of a new nation, which is undergoing a pain, which is undergoing a process which is very painful, a process of conversion, painful conversion from a colonial to a new colonial continent to wholly defining, self-determining nation. So this is what their works highlight. So in the next lecture, I will talk about the other aspects. Especially, I will finish the introduction part of African literature, and then I will try to look into the important text written by the various writers. Thank you.